Welcome. This is a session on caching large navigation menus. I'm Benji Fisher. That's today's date, I think. Before we get started, I did that. Thank you, Kevin. And there's a blog post version of this talk at isovera.com/blog/caching large navigation menus-Drupal. So about me. My name is Benji Fisher. My username is Benji Fisher on Drupal.org. My 10-year Drupalversary is coming up soon. Same username on GitHub and GitLab. But someone else grabbed it on Twitter. I was kind of slow to join Twitter, so I had to insert my favorite number, Benji17 Fisher. And my avatar on, I think, all of these is the yellow pig. And that's why I go around to conferences wearing the yellow pig hat, so that people who might recognize my avatar from online will recognize who I am. And I could go into the backstory of the yellow pig during the question and answer session if you're curious. Just this week, I started work at Hook 42. I haven't yet gone through the indoctrination, so I can't tell you all the wonderful things they do. Next time I give a talk, I'll do that. But I'm looking forward to working with a nice group of people, and nice and talented group of people at Hook 42. So, book navigation needs to be cached. So, here's the screenshot. It looks a little out of focus, doesn't it? It looks nice and crisp on my screen. Now it says don't change this, don't change that while you're recording, but it doesn't say anything about focusing the projectors. Ooh, that's an improvement. And I think that's an improvement. So here's a client I was working for. And they have all of their technical documentation in Drupal, and they are using the Drupal Hook module, which many people think is a stupid idea, but they're doing it. So they have, the text of the documentation page over there, and then they have the navigation over here. And I know you can't read the text, but that's okay. All I want you to notice is the indentation levels, and possibly notice that this second line from the bottom is bolded. That happens to be the link for the current page. So what we have here is a lot more links than you can see, but just most of them are collapsed, and just enough of them are expanded so you can get to the current one. So here we have the current one and its siblings, and then we have a parent and a parent and a parent, and its siblings, or maybe one level up, and then a parent and its siblings, and the root of the book. And this is the navigation section of the page. And it is actually much larger in terms of number of characters of HTML, and much more expensive to render than the actual content on the page. So it's important to cache this because it's very expensive to compute. So here are some numbers. In one book that I was looking at, there were over 4,000 pages. So on the one hand, that means there are over 4,000 different pages on which we're going to be rendering the navigation. And on the other hand, it means that on each one of those pages, there are 4,472 links that have to be rendered. And you tell me, what does the, sorry, I meant to go up, not left. Well, roughly speaking, what does the HTML markup for this look like?
Very deep.
Very deep what?
Tags.
Exactly. So each one of these is an anchor tag, so it's a link. But then they're organized into unordered lists, and those unordered lists are nested. That's the markup we're talking about. So it turns out that the navigation was 2.7 megabytes, We were rendering it twice on each page. You know why? Once for desktop, once for mobile. We fixed that, but someone else got to do that.
Were there different renderings for each of those or something?
Yeah, only one of them was visible at the time. Were there different renderings?
Different logic? Maybe like
No. So for the recording questions, were there different renderings for the mobile and the desktop navigation? I think it was rendered twice, but there weren't any differences.
Okay.
It was the same thing rendered twice. Before I started working on it, it took 40 to 50 seconds on the initial page load. And after I did some preliminary caching work, the second page load would be 6 to 9 seconds. So even with some initial attention to caching, it was still long. And after I did the work I'm describing here, I cut it down to 2 to 3 seconds. So on the one hand, when someone brags about getting his page load times down to 3 seconds, you think, this guy must be a back-end developer. On the other hand, it's a factor of 3 improvement over the status quo ante before what it was before I worked on it. So normally I don't brag about 3-second page load times, but it's at least better than it was before, significantly better than it was before. And I was not very sophisticated about these timing estimates. These were just running the site locally and clicking the reload page and starting a timer on my phone and seeing how it went. But at least I was using the same method before and after. So I think there's some consistency in the numbers. Although you get different numbers in different ways of measuring. So the strategy is, first of all, use the same navigation on each page. Why would you want to have different navigations on different pages? Well, you want to expand the navigation to show the link to the current page. And the way that's done is just by adding some CSS classes to the active trail. So going down through that sequence of unordered lists, add a CSS class so that the ones leading down to the current page are all expanded. And initially that was done with PHP. When you render the page, you have a class on enough unordered lists to show the path down to the current page. Get rid of that. Don't do that at render time. Don't add the CSS classes at render time. Use the same markup for every page, and then set the active trail with JavaScript, client side. So those points 1 and 2 go together. Deciding to set those CSS classes with JavaScript means that we can use the same navigation on every single page in the book. And then once you're using the same navigation on all pages of the book, cache it once per book. So once it's the same on every page, we only need one copy of it. We don't need a different cached copy per page. Make sense? By the way, I've got a slide at the end that says questions, but please interrupt me at any point with questions. I'd rather have them during the talk than ask you to remember them till the end. So let me say a little bit about internal versus external caching. Caching is one of the things that Drupal 8 does really, really well. It's one of the strengths. Now, an internal cache is where Drupal saves little bits and pieces of the page it's rendering. In my local development environment, it's always saving in the database. On production, it might be saving in a Memcache or Redis server. The good news is that I don't care. It works the same way, whether it's using the database as an internal cache or whether it's saving it to Memcache or Redis. And yeah, that's sort of the nice thing about having APIs. It's a cache backend. That's all I need to know. I don't need to know what's behind that backend. whether it's database or memcache. The external cache is used typically for entire pages. The external cache could be the database, could be Varnish or a CDN. And again, as far as Drupal is concerned, it works the same regardless of whether you're caching pages in the database or CDN or Varnish. And an external cache sits in between Drupal and the user's browser. So Drupal saves it in the cache, Varnish save, and user actually hits Varnish, and Varnish, if it has a saved copy, sends it to the user, and if not, Varnish fetches it from Drupal. Another name for an external cache is a reverse proxy, which I think is one of the worst terms ever. The difference between a reverse proxy and a proxy, both of them sit in between the back end and the user. A reverse proxy is something that's sort of controlled server side, and a regular proxy is something that's served client side. So if you know on your company VPN you have to reroute through some proxy server, that's a proxy. And if at the server end, over the far gulf of the internet, over at the server end, we decide we don't want you hitting our PHP and MySQL, we'll put in a reverse proxy. But both of them are things that sit in between the back end and the user. I just think that reverse is a very silly way of describing the difference. So the hard part, whether you're talking internal or external caches, the hard part is knowing when to use the cache value and when you need to calculate it fresh. And it's a standard saying that there are only two hard things in computer science: naming things, off by one errors, and cache invalidation. So this is one of the two hard things in computer science. Obligatory bad joke. So I'm going to go through at this point sort of how it all fits together, how we get this menu navigation into the rendered page and cache it. So there are various pieces here that you can pay as much attention to as you like, and then I'm going to focus specifically on the caching pieces after going through this little section on how it all fits together. So in Drupal we have a Twig template, and this is sort of a simplified version of the template we use. If there's a tree element, we will render it, and we wrap it in some other stuff. There's some nav with a nav tag with a bunch of classes and stuff, an aria labeled by. There's a link to the top level of the book, and then there's the tree, which is the expensive part, the big part. That's a simplified version of the Twig template. If you're curious, here's the actual Twig template that's used. It almost fits without scrolling in this page. And I guess I just left out a couple of ifs and end ifs in the simplified version. So what's the Drupal code that works into it? So on hook node view, this is the Drupal hook that gets triggered when we are starting to render a node. And we're going to generate a render array, and what we're going to do, render array is called build. We're going to add a sub-render array to the build array. We're going to add a child to the build array, and we call it hook nav. I think I've already scrolled here. Yeah. So let me scroll back up to the top. So build is an array that's passed by reference, so we can add something to it. There are a couple of things where we say, if I'm not supposed to be here, then I will exit early. So a couple of ifs, some condition or another, that I'll return. Then I calculate the book ID, which is something I get from the node. I load the sort of parent book node and check access on that. And again, if I'm not supposed to be there, I return. But then after all of these checks and after I've calculated the book ID, then the main part is what I had accidentally scrolled to before. I add this render array to the build array. And it has a custom theme book nav. And we pass the book ID. Those two pieces of information are going to be enough to calculate the navigation for this particular book. And then there are these cache entries, and we'll come back and look closely at the cache entries later. But I just wanted to show them in situ. This is where they are in the render array. Book theme, since I'm using a custom theme, I declare it here. The theme is book nav. That's the theme that I used in the previous slide. And it has just one argument, the book ID, which is a number, so I give it a default value of 0. And then there's a preprocess function. This is a little complicated, but in fact, most of this code was here before I started working on the project, so I don't worry about it too much. Close to the top, it sets variable with tree. And again, as I was previewing my slides, I scrolled. Let me unscroll. So the sort of important part here is down near the bottom of the screen where we set the tree variable. That's what's going to be rendered in the Twig template. And the lines above it are what calculate that. So there's some Drupal service book.manager, and we get a book manager. And then we call a couple of methods on that. But again, as I said, most of this is code that was here before. But this is doing the hard work. And maybe I should mention that it is a lot of work. We have to find all of the pages in the book, each of which is going to be a different Drupal node. And then we have to at least load the title and the path for each page of the book. And we have to order them in the right order, and we have to have them in the right nested structure that we can construct the menu navigation tree out of them, all those nested unordered lists that we were talking about. So this is where all of that does. It's fairly expensive, but this is the part that was done before I worked on the project. And then what's at the bottom? At the bottom, we add a couple of more variables that the Twig template can use. The title of the parent book, a Boolean that says whether or not something's empty. Is the top level book just an empty node with no body, or is it actually a page in itself? And we'll do something different in the Twig template depending on that variable. But the expensive one to calculate is the tree. And here's the JavaScript I mentioned. Let me see, was I scrolling here? I think it mostly fits. So frankly, this is a lot simpler than the PHP code that was there to add the active class to enough unordered lists so that you could see that menu link open. And this is what jQuery is good at. This ends up being a lot simpler than the PHP code it replaces. And part of this code was here before I got to it. The part I added is this little block here, where I take context.location.pathname. That's the path of the current page. And then I look for anchor elements, links, whose href attribute is equal to the current page. So I look for the link to the current page. And then I say, hey jQuery, add the active class to the link for the current page. And then climb up the DOM tree until I find the whatever class I've put on the book. The top of the book navigation. And as I climb up the DOM tree, add nav list expanded, and then find the children of the list element, find the anchor children, and add the active class to those. So this is some basic jQuery, 6 lines of jQuery. It says, find the link to the current page, put a CSS class on it, climb up that tree of nested lists, and put a CSS class on every list element and every anchor element that we find. And I sort of think there's a pun I could make here based on render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, but it's probably not worth making the pun, because if I misquote Jesus, probably someone will be offended, and I shouldn't do that. But let JavaScript render what JavaScript should render. So I'm not being too close to the holy word. So now let's zero in on the cache tags portion of the Hook node view. So here's that render array that we were adding in Hook node view. Again, it was calling the custom theme. It was passing a particular book ID. So saying here, give me the navigation tree for that particular book. And now I want to look at these particular cache entries: keys, contexts, tags, and max age.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
Can you describe the cache values there? Keys, contexts, tags, and max age?
That's what
I mean, I can understand max age, but the other ones, I want to learn more about the cache tags and these things.
Yeah, the question is, can I describe the entries in the cache array? And that's exactly what the next slides go through.
Perfect.
Yes, that's the point of the talk. So the cache keys, I said PDN book nav, that's a unique string that identifies these are my cache entries. Okay, these are the ones I have control over. I decide when they're invalidated, and my code is going to be pulling these things out of the cache. So that's the first key is that unique string, and then the second key is the book ID. So someone else who's caching some other information for other purposes is going to have a different initial string, so we're not going to invalidate each other's cache, and we're not going to use each other's cache.
What accesses cache keys? Like where's that key pulled up as far as like something that uses it?
So in the database, it's part of the cache ID. We'll see that later. So I'm sorry, what's the question again?
Well, I was just, so like it has a book ID, so there's I'm trying to visualize where the keys are stored and where it is, where it fits within the caching structure, sort of.
Okay, so the question is where are the cache keys stored?
And so this is like the cache ID entry.
Yes.
This is how we cache once per book. So when it has the key, that's like an identifier for the cache entry.
Right. The cache key identifies, in this case, the menu navigation for this particular book. So PDN book nav, that's the unique string that says we're talking about the menu navigation that I'm currently working on. Mm-hmm. And then the menu navigation for which book, well, that's where the book ID comes in.
Okay.
So those two pieces of information say that I'm caching the menu navigation for this particular book. And there might be several different documentation books on the site, this particular one. Now, if I wanted to cache once per page of the book, then instead of the book ID, I'd be passing in the node ID of the current node. I'm just passing in the ID of the book, the parent book of the page I'm looking at. Now, if I didn't specify cache keys, then all the other cache data I passed in, the max age, the cache tags, and the cache contexts, would just bubble up to the parent render array. Often that's what you want to do. Often you are using a block. And the block goes into a region. That's what Drupal usually does. And blocks sort of automatically get their own cache keys. And so it's okay to let your cache data bubble up to the block, and then the block will be cached by itself. In this particular project, they weren't doing it that way. I don't know why. But in this particular project, I had to make sure that my render array got cached. So it was crucial that I added the keys. And that's an easy point to miss. It's not very well documented. And I guess it's not very documented because it's an unusual use case, because typically you're using blocks and the block will take care of that.
One more question.
Yeah.
It says keys. So can this be multiple keys per cache entry for like, so is it can it be an array too, or is it a key in a pair, like a typical?
So the question is, can the keys be multiple? And yes, the keys are an array. This array happens to have 2 elements, but you could have 3 or 10 or 20.
It does, and it's not a specific format. It's just an array of the values.
It is not a specific format. It's whatever values you want. I guess it has to be string-like things or things that can be cast as strings. So in this case, a literal string and then a numeric variable.
Okay, I understand better. I was looking at it as like, I didn't see it was comma. I was thinking like the book ID was associated with the book nav. So now that I understand, that makes more sense.
That's right. It's not PVA and book nav is the key and book ID is the value. It's not that. It's 2 separate elements in a simple array, not a keyed array. So the second thing in the cache array is contexts. I put in languages, and I know at least one of you was in the previous talk, so here's some overlap with that one. If the book is viewed in another language, then all the link text will change. Possibly the paths to the different pages will change, and so we need a separate copy for a different language. In fact, the site I'm working on is not multilingual, but maybe it will be someday, and I thought I should be a little proactive. We'll see later that I actually didn't have to do this. But it's just as well that I did, because now I have an example to talk about cache contexts. And then cache tags. These are important. These determine when this cache entry will be invalidated. So there's a trade-off here. So I only passed in one cache tag, and it's a string, node colon, and then the numeric book ID. And what that means is that when the book is updated, when that particular node is updated, we will delete these this cache entry. Or maybe that's not strictly true. Maybe we don't actually delete it when it's updated. Maybe after it's been updated. No, I think that is true. I think it is deleted. The other possibility is that the next time it checks the cache, it will decide to reject it. But I think it's actually deleted when the node is changed. So it's possible that one of the child pages will be edited before the book is. And a title or the link to one of the child pages might change. And the way I'm doing it, I might get incorrect data if that happens. Now, in this particular project, the way these books are imported by an automatic process, that shouldn't happen. Now, if the individual pages were being actively edited, then it would be a bad thing not to update the links in the navigation. And we would have to put in a cache tag for every single page in the book. So instead of just one cache tag, one number for the book ID, I need all 4,472 IDs of the nodes making up the book, which means, more stuff to save in the database under the tags entry, and potentially more stuff to check for when we have to invalidate it. So I think for this particular project, it was appropriate to use just the single book ID, since we were doing sort of mass import of these documentation books.
So the trade-off was that if an individual book page was edited, does it invalidate the entire book and have that structure re-rendered, or is it? I'm just
yes. So the question is, what gets invalidated when one of these cache tags changes? And when you say invalidate the book, we're only talking about the navigation for the book.
Right.
So yes, the way I have it set up currently, the only time the navigation cache entry gets deleted is when the parent, the book node, gets changed. And the trade-off would be if I had a cache tag for every page in the book, that's a lot of cache tags. And then it would be more reliable data that when any one of the nodes gets changed, any page in the book gets changed, we would invalidate our cache entry. So we'd be more sure that we're serving current data, but the trade-off is that to be more sure of serving more data, you're invalidating your cache completely. Yeah?
So did you add this function to the preprocess function of the parent book?
Did I add?
Where is this code? What preprocess function to have this?
The question is, where does this code go? So let us back up a little bit. And this came from hook node view. Here it is, hook node view. So this is the Drupal hook that lets us change the render array for viewing a node. And here's the whole render array that I'm adding. I'm calling it book nav. I'm giving it the theme and the book ID to calculate, do all the calculation, the expensive calculation, and then this is where all of these cache entries live. And now we're drilling down into those cache entries, and we've talked about keys, and we're working on, talked about context, and we're working on tags. You're welcome.
Is this a pretty common pattern for naming tags for the just for naming tags in general? The node colon ID.
So the question is this a common pattern for naming the cache tags? And yes, I think it is. In fact, it pretty much has to be. You can't use just anything you want. You couldn't use, for example, the bare book ID because Drupal wouldn't understand when to invalidate it. I have to say node colon number so that when that particular node changes, Drupal knows to invalidate it. So what I'm working on here, remember I talked about the internal versus the external cache. What I'm working on here is all part of the internal cache. This is one piece of the page that Drupal is building, so this is part of the internal cache. At the page level, which is related to the external cache, these cache tags are sent in the HTTP headers, which is another reason that I don't want to have 4,472 of them in here, because all of that will bubble up to the page level, and you'll be telling your external page cache or Varnish or your CDN that when any of those changes, the page I'm looking at has to change. So that's a lot of stuff in page headers. I've run into troubles where I've had too many cache tags in my HTTP headers. That's something you have to look out for too. And just as the internal cache entry will be invalidated when, in this case, when the book ID changes. This also tells the external cache, the varnisher CDN, to do the same, to invalidate its copy when any of these changes.
I think I heard something about that, is the length of the cache tags is limited by varnish or something, that if it's to a certain, it was in one of the sessions yesterday, they were saying they ran into some problems where they had too many cache tags that they were trying to pass across at one time, and it just messes things out really fussy.
Yes, the varnish has limits on how many cache tags you can pass in the HTTP headers. So,
do you know if it's based on like the length of the strings or the amount of the tags?
I think varnish just regards an HTTP header as a string, and it doesn't care whether it's 400 10-letter things that have been concatenated or 4,000 one-character things that have been concatenated. It just cares about the total length of the string.
So it may just, if you pass too many, it just cuts it off at a certain length and goes haywire.
Oh, what happens if there are too many? Does it get truncated? I don't know. It stops working.
Cool.
So I think the last thing is perhaps the easiest to understand. The last cache entry is the max age. I chose cache permanent, which means that it's not time-based. Until one of the other things changes, keep it as long as you can. So understand how these things are working. It's nice to peek at the database. Now, again, I talked about the internal cache, could be Memcache or Redis. I'm working on my local copy of the site, and everything is in the database where it's easy for me to look at it. And again, the system should work just the same way if the internal cache is one of those other systems. But it's convenient for me that it's in the database because I like doing database queries. Drush SQL C, and I'm connected to my database, and all of these cache entries will be stored in the cache render table. And so I ask MySQL, please tell me what the cache render table looks like. And it tells me that there's a primary key, CID, cache ID. There's data, which is a long blob. That's the huge HTML for the navigation that I'm actually caching. There's an expire, which is an int, that's a date stamp. Created is 14.3. I think that's a decimal date stamp. There's serialized, which is just a Boolean, so it's a small int. Is this serialized data or is this actual string data? There's the cache tags. That has to be long text because sometimes cache tags are lots of things concatenated together. And then there's some sort of checksum, which I never bothered to look at. So, once again, we'll look at each of these individually. So I can select all of the things I'm interested in, the cache ID, the expiration, created, the tags, and the checksum from cache render. I want the cache ID, the CID, to be like PDN book, because that's my unique string identifying my cache entries. And I'll limit to just one element. Do you know what the \G does in a MySQL query?
That's where I just took a picture because I've never seen that. I think it puts it on different lines, right?
Exactly. It puts it on different lines rather than making a table out of it with one entry in the row per result. It'll have, for the first entry, I'm only looking at one, so I'll just get one row with all these stars, and then if I didn't limit it to one, the second row would say 2.row with all those stars. I was actually in a training on Drupal performance improvement, and David Strauss from Pantheon was one of the trainers, so it was a great training. He did not know about the \G. He ended all of his MySQL queries with semicolon, and I said, use \G instead. So I got to teach David Strauss something about MySQL queries. So there's the cache ID, which is this long string. We'll look at it more closely on the next slide. Expire, created, tag. We'll look at each of these more closely on the following slides. So the cache ID, CID. I've inserted some line breaks to make it easier to read. So there's PDN booknav, that's my unique string. 704369, that's the book ID, the node ID of the parent book node. And then there are languages and theme and user permissions. So I specified languages as a cache context. But where did these other two come from? Well, these are default cache contexts. So I'll explain that a little further later. And user permissions is some hash of all the permissions that the current user has. So the first 3 bits are things that I've already specified. The others come from some sort of default, and you can tell that the theme and the user permissions come from contexts like the languages because they're in square brackets. So square brackets indicates that we're looking at cache contexts. And part of this slide got cut off, but it says I'll look at those things later. Max age is easy. I specified no max age. I said cache permanent, so the expire is a -1. Presumably, if I said cache it for 1 hour, 3,600 seconds, then the expire would be 3,600 more than the created time.
Do you only put seconds in there, or minutes and hours?
I think it's always. The question is, can you do you always put seconds, or can you put minutes and hours? And I'm pretty sure it always has to be timestamped, so it's converted to seconds. So the database stores seconds, regardless of how you describe it at higher levels. The database understands timestamps. So I didn't do experiments, but I assumed that if I had specified an hour, that expire instead of being -1 would be 3,600 more than the created time. So the cache tags, well, the node colon 704369, that's the part I put in. And the other stuff, I'm not entirely sure where it came from, but I didn't care too much. Okay, so where do these permissions come from? And if you look at your services.yaml file in site's default, it has this very helpful code comment. Yay, Drupal is nice. Sometimes it has helpful code comments. Renderer required cache contexts. The renderer will automatically associate these cache contexts with every render array, varying every render array by these cache contexts. And the default cache contexts are languages, the theme, and user.permissions. So that's why those 3 things were added as part of the cache ID, because those are the default cache contexts. So if for some reason you have a site where you don't want to vary depending on user permissions, you say, I will explicitly tell you when something is admin only or not. Don't do this. But if you did want to do that, then you would remove user.permissions from these default cache contexts in your services.yaml. You can change it. But these are good, sensible defaults for most cases. Oops, what did I just do? What key did I press? Did I just go to dark mode? There. So that's all I got. Any more questions? Yeah.
The piece of code of Twig template and jQuery, those are not involved in the cache. So the main cache activity specified is in the node view that doesn't later.
Yeah, so I'm just going to repeat the question for the recording. The Twig template and the JavaScript snippet that I showed, the question is, are those related to caching or not? And the answer is no, they're not. Caching all goes on in the render array, and the cache section of the render array, and those various entries that we talked about in the second half of the talk. Welcome. Anything else?
So I've been wanting to understand the cache, because I've always kind of, known that things get cached, and I've just looked at it as magic, but now with the cache tags and having to do more with varnish and all these other things, it's a lot more important, I think.
Mm-hmm.
In that last slide, it had like context. It's like, what exactly is context in relation to the database entry?
Okay, so the question is that we're glad to be digging into the caching system to understand how it works, and cache tags are important, and people talk about those a little more because they're involved in page caching. But exactly how do the cache contexts get involved in the database?
Right.
That's the question.
Yeah, so it was a statement and a bit of a question.
Right.
I was like, I really appreciate learning about this, and I want to pick your brain a little bit if possible.
Okay, so let's back up through these slides a bit. Here are the the default cache contexts are languages, theme, and user.permissions. And we see those in the database in the cache ID. So here's where I took the cache ID and I added some line breaks for readability.
Mm-hmm.
So those things in brackets are the cache contexts. That's where it gets stored in the database.
And so I saw, and the language was set when you put the language in there as something you said you didn't necessarily need to do yet, but is that right? Is that where that came
right.
from?
Well, it comes from two places. So in fact, when I started this and when I wrote the cache section of my render array, I said, they might be translating this site in the near future. I will be proactive and tell them to put in languages in the cache contexts. But in fact, I didn't have to be proactive because it is already one of the global default cache contexts. So I could have removed that line from my render array and exactly the same thing would be saved in the database. So this I think explicitly answers your question of where the cache contexts come in the database. They get concatenated into a string for the cache ID. So the cache ID is a bunch of things concatenated together into a string separated by colons, and we start off with the cache keys that I specified, my unique string and the node ID, and then these things that come from the cache contexts. So the current language, the current theme, and a permissions cache for the currently
But
logged
are
user.
you going out of the context to ask how the permissions is hashed? Is it like hashing the roles, or is it, is that going a little bit out of because I see it's a hash, but I don't know.
So the question is more detail about that hash. Frankly, I don't know. I never looked into it. I assume just because of the name of the way it's named, that it is based on the actual permissions that the current user has. Which is something to think about when you're working on other things in Drupal. Sometimes we sort of cheat and we say, okay, we'll show this view for a particular role. That might have some effects on the caching. So maybe we should stick to the role-based access system where a role really is just a collection of permissions, and whenever we decide to do something or not, we decide it based on a permission rather than a role.
It makes me also think a little bit about if one page could be cached for two different roles, and how varnish, is the user permission part of the tag? It's not. It's not part of the tags that you send, right?
So the question is, can varnish pay attention to the user permissions? And I think the answer is no, because I don't think varnish gets the cache ID. Varnish gets the cache tags.
Right.
The render table gets this cache ID. And I might be wrong about that. It's possible that Varnish does get the cache ID in some sense. You'd have to look at the HTTP headers that get sent off to Varnish to know that for sure. So let me be honest about that and say I don't know.
I heard somebody saying yesterday that there is the ability to cache pages from logged in users, authenticated users, but I don't know exactly what the details are either. So if it's just like, yeah, I don't have any idea. I don't think I have any other things that you found while digging into caches and interesting.
So the comment is that we've heard that Drupal can cache things even for logged in users, not just anonymous users. And the question is whether I've learned any other things about caching. No, this is the only time I've dug into the cache system, and I studied enough to understand pretty well what I was currently doing. I didn't do any research for the sake of research.
Your slide's going to be up.
Oh, my slides are already up. Yeah, I'll certainly put a link to them on the Badcamp page. But all of my slides, I mentioned at the top that I'm Benji Fisher on GitLab. If you go to gitlab.com/Benji Fisher and you look for slide decks, which is currently at the top, and you scroll down to the top of the README, there is a link to my GitLab pages, and currently at the top are the live version of my slides. So they're already online, and there will soon be a link from the Badcamp page. Well, thank you. You've been a very friendly audience. I like getting the questions.